Let's take a closer look at why the consolidated exchange rates might differ for the same currency pairs in the same accounting period. It is often assumed that the consolidated exchange rates for the same currency pairs in NetSuite should match, but that's really not often the case. The reason for that is the definitions of the consolidated exchange rates that we've covered in this course. We know that the current rate is the same as the month-end spot rate, so that will match across entities that use the same currency pairs. We should expect to see differences in the average rate and the historical rate because, as we know, those are measured as the weighted average exchange rate for the transactions entered into those subsidiaries for that given accounting period. As an example, if we have a German entity and a French entity, both measured in euros and both report to a UK parent entity measured in GBP, as we look at the exchange rate pair of euro to GBP, we will expect the current rate to be the same, of course, that month-end spot rate doesn't change. However, depending upon the transactions entered into the German entity and the French entity for that accounting period, we should expect to see different average and historical consolidated exchange rates. We'll jump into NetSuite shortly and take a closer look. Before we do, I want to call out an important point. Some of you may have already noticed when we've looked at the consolidated exchange rates table that the calculator icon is missing from a number of the currency pairs. The reason for that is those exchange rates are what we call indirect exchange rates. In other words, NetSuite derives those rates from other rates within the system. There's two use cases here to consider. The first being that the currency pairs are the same, USD to USD, CAD to CAD. The exchange rate will always be 1, so there's no calculation required. The other scenario to consider is where we have subsidiary pairs that have a gap in the hierarchy. So we would be looking at kind of a child entity and an ultimate parent, where the parent entity in the middle is missing. As such, NetSuite derives those rates instead from existing consolidated exchange rates. Let's jump into NetSuite and take a closer look, and that should make some more sense. Let's navigate to our consolidated exchange rates table. As we can see here, for our German entity for January 2023, we have our consolidated exchange rates. When compared to our French entity, we can see that the current rate is the same when we're looking at the currency pair of euro to GBP. We can also see that both the average and historical rates differ between the two currency pairs, despite being in the same accounting period. The reason for that is we have transactions recorded against our German entity in January 2023, and we do not have any transactions for our French entity in that period. That also explains why the exchange rates are exactly the same for our French entity. Let's take a look at the other use cases that we had mentioned, where the current average and historical rates are 1 because the currency pair is the same. So let's take a look at our Singapore entity that rolls up to our APAC parent entity, both of which are measured in the Singapore dollar. When we take a closer look at the consolidated exchange rate, we can see here the rates are 1, and that the exchange rate derived checkbox is not checked because there is no exchange rate to derive. It's always 1. But let's come back to our consolidated exchange rates table and look at a scenario where the consolidated exchange rates are indeed derived. Here's a good example. So for our Japanese entity measured in the Japanese yen compared to our ultimate parent entity measured in US dollar, the consolidated exchange rates are 0.008, and we can see here that the calculator icon is missing. As we take a look at the record here, we can see that the exchange rate is derived. The reason for that is between our Japanese entity and our US ultimate parent sits the APAC parent entity. That's missing from the hierarchy, therefore the consolidated exchange rates are derived. We'll see in a moment how they're derived, but what NetSuite will do is take the consolidated exchange rates between our ultimate parent entity and our APAC parent entity and multiply that by the exchange rate between our Japanese entity and our APAC entity. Let's actually prove that out. So coming back to our consolidated exchange rates table, let's see how NetSuite actually arrives at this value of 0.0827. So first, let's find the exchange rate between our Japanese entity and our APAC parent entity. And we can see that here of 0.01127397, and that will be multiplied by the exchange rate between our APAC parent entity and our ultimate parent entity. So we can see here our APAC parent entity and our ultimate parent entity, the exchange rate is 0.7377. So let's multiply that by 0.7337, 843. And we can see here that we arrive back at that exchange rate we saw earlier of 0.0827. And that's how you can validate the exchange rates that are derived by NetSuite.